I'm kind of interested in your early career, like how you got into this. How did you start making these films, and where did your interest, and how did it lead you to find this window that opened up in front of you?
Well, I was always interested in the space between nonfiction and fiction. I think I was really always interested in how what appears to be our factual world uh, is actually constituted through something that, or made up of something that eludes the journalistic lens, at least, which is that actually what appears to be our factual world is constituted through myriad interlocking fantasies and stories. So I was always interested in that sort of space between the two forms. My mentor was Dusan Makavejev, the Yugoslav master, who made such films as W.R., Mysteries of the Organism, Sweet Movie, Innocence Unprotected. And my first films, which I made in college, combined fiction and documentary in ways maybe that follow really in his footsteps. And then I moved to England after college. I had a scholarship and started writing scripts, thinking I would make more work that was also maybe having documentary elements in it, as Dusan's work had, but from a fiction perspective. But I didn't find that the writing and the rewriting and the planning of what was going to come was embodied the kind of, or sort of embodied the kind of exploration of the world that I sought from filmmaking. And around that time, cameras were becoming cheap and light, and you were able to edit at home for the first time, with Final Cut Pro. And I started to realize that there was a whole realm of nonfiction cinema that I'd never explored. And I discovered Jean Rouch, who would have people playing themselves and making up stories, acting out fantasies, and then screening that back to them. And then a friend of mine invited me, I was experimenting with that in London, and then a friend of mine invited me and my then collaborator, Christine Sin, to go to Indonesia to help a group of plantation workers make a film to document their struggle to organize a union. And I was interested at that point, that was back in 2001, I was becoming aware, as everyone was then, of globalization, but more specifically the violence that underpins it. That what appears to be free trade has actually been achieved at the barrel of a gun and through tremendous loss of life, and in some ways had been the continuation of colonialism in some instances. So I said yes to that. I was interested in what I would find. And I knew nothing about Indonesia, but I said, I won't direct the film, but I will help, we will facilitate the plantation workers to make their own film. And when I arrived, I found really horrible conditions. I found that the plantation workers were suffering those conditions because they were, first of all, being intimidated, bullied, attacked, and afraid to do much about it because their parents and grandparents had been killed for being in a union. And that was how I came across the Indonesian genocide and came across the fear that actually was killing the people I was living with. I was 27 years old, and I thought I will do whatever I can as a filmmaker to disrupt the functioning of this fear, to expose it, to expose the lies on which it was based. I wasn't sure, but I started talking with these plantation workers who I now understood were survivors of mass killing. Started talking about, what if we made a film about why you were afraid, about what is it like to live surrounded by the still powerful perpetrators who murdered your loved ones, to have to meet them every day in the market. That thematically is very close to what The Look of Silence turned out to be. There would be a very long detour before we could make that film. As the army threatened the survivors not to participate in the film, they told me to try and film the perpetrators, and that what I found there led to the act of killing.
Yeah, it's so fascinating how the films complement each other, and I found this one to be just so emotional and so intimate. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting when I talk to other documentary filmmakers about how they approach their subjects. And in most cases it's oh yeah, we're just very straight up about what we're trying to do, and we show the people who we are, and then they trust us, and it's this kind of thing. But with you, it's you're undercover basically. It feels like you're kind of you're going in there and you're trying to expose something, but you're not trying to expose yourself.
Every documentary filmmaker you've ever met, if they were to make a film with a perpetrator, a boastful perpetrator, to gather key information about how an atrocity was committed, would inevitably become more like an investigative journalist than a fully open filmmaker. But be that as it may, as soon as I met Anwar Congo, mind you, he was the 41st perpetrator I filmed at the end of a 2-year process. He opened, the reason I lingered on him was because his pain was close to the surface. His facade of boastfulness had a crack. In fact, I saw that the facade existed in order to cover up his pain. And I realized that all this boasting I've spent 2 years documenting, and all the perpetrators, including all the perpetrators you meet in The Look of Silence, all this boasting is actually defensive and not genuine pride. And when I realized that, that crack in Anwar's facade became the crack through which I could enter and be open myself. And I was very open about how I felt about what Anwar was telling me, and in return he opened up about his nightmares. And when people around him, in The Act of Killing, you see Adi Zulkadri warning Anwar, don't make this film. You see a minister in the cabinet, Minister of Youth and Sport warning Anwar, we shouldn't be showing ourselves this way. Anwar continues, despite those warnings. And it's because I think he's fine, not because he's looking glorious, not because he's been tricked to think that he's going to look like a hero, but because finally someone's listening to him. And finally someone is approaching him as a human being and actually trying to empathize with what it does to his humanity and to the whole society around him, this terrible legacy of atrocity.
Were you afraid to enter this world, and how does, because I sort of, when I say you being undercover, I just sort of feel like there's a line you're walking, and it's very
there was.
delicate.
It's a complicated and delicate line. With The Act of Killing, I was emotionally afraid to go into Anwar's pain, to go into the horror of what he's done and the horror of the lies he's told himself, out of actually, not because he's immoral, but because actually he's moral. He knows it's wrong and feels guilt. Yeah. And then to see that leads to further evil. That the lies themselves lead to further evil. The justification leads to further evil. That was terrifying emotionally. I don't know if you've ever seen the uncut Act of Killing, the 2-hour and 40-minute version, but you remember the scene in there where Anwar butchers a teddy bear. That was one of the most important, I think that's one of the most important moments in either film that didn't make it into the short version of the short American version of The Act of Killing, where Anwar throws himself despairingly into sort of the worst part of who he is. And it's actually that leads to the kind of self-pity that leads him to play the victim. It's a very important emotional loop or arc that's missing from the shorter version. It's really one of the most important things in the film, I think. But after shooting that, it was so painful and frightening that I went home. While we were shooting it, Anwar noticed I was crying and said, Joshua, you're crying, and what should we do? And I said, we have to continue. And I felt almost like I was responsible for the horror that was being revealed by the camera, and went home and sort of felt this mixture of guilt and filth and taint. And I had nightmares, and that was maybe the straw that broke the camel's back and led me to 8 months of insomnia. I don't think that, actually, I don't say this to scare people off from seeing the longer cut. I think actually it's probably easier in some way, the longer cut, because it has moments of pause and moments of rest and quiet, and also moments where we can feel Anwar's own torment, so we can empathize with him more easily. Yeah. But it has this moment that was, for me, that's very emotionally frightening. But The Look of Silence, in contrast, was physically frightening but emotionally healing to film.
Yeah, it feels that way too. And
I think, of course, you asked this, you sort of questioned whether we were undercover. In The Look of Silence, we were undercover, in a sense. When I would approach the perpetrators with Adi, I would always say, Adi is a friend of mine. He has a personal, I would always say, you know me from 7 years ago. You know that I've been making another film with your commanders and your superiors, but the film hadn't come out yet. So I'm shooting this film between the two, but after The Act of Killing's been edited, but before it's come out, at which point I know I cannot safely return to Indonesia. I come with Adi and I say, here I am with a man. He's an optometrist. He also has a personal connection to these issues. This time I want to try a slightly new method where you and Adi discuss, and I'll document the discussion. I might intervene here and there and give you both suggestions about questions to ask. But I really want to see how you talk about it together. And in return, as a thank you, Adi will give you a free eye test, and if you need glasses, we will provide you with glasses. That's a kind of undercover approach.
Right. it was one of those things where it's like, metaphors in films are one thing, and I sort of am always curious about how these are found. I'm not necessarily like into metaphors in films, but I feel like that and the image of the butterfly eggs they're just images that are screaming of this situation and of the emotional weight that's under this stuff. How designed were those visual cues, and or did you just find them and were attuned to them when they happened?
You grow, I think, for a metaphor to really, I think it's first of all very important that metaphors in film retain a mystery. So we can talk about, sort of obvious layers of meaning in those metaphors. Adi is a man whose profession is to help people see, and he's confronting people who are willfully blind. And the film itself is exposing the terrible costs of that willful blindness. And the butterfly, the sort of jumping beans somehow embody something that's bursting to come out, that needs to come out, but that is so subtle it might not even be there anymore. I feel like but at the same time, these images, and particularly the way they appear in the film, have layers of mystery that I don't know, where I can't say what it means. Like, why is it necessary to go from Inong, actually the perpetrator is wearing the glasses, in a total impasse, twitching with rage, saying, turn off the camera, and I refuse to because I know that we're bearing witness to something unprecedented that's going to help break 50 years of silence. And it's not, and I have a greater duty than my duty to Inong, so I don't turn off the camera. He's twitching with rage, cutting from that to the beans that are jumping. I can't say exactly what that means. And then to hear over the beans, Adi's son asking his daughter, well, did you have your tooth pulled yesterday? I don't know what that means, but it is a metaphor for something. So first of all, metaphor in cinema needs to have that enduring mystery. It can't be something you can fully translate. And secondly, it is something you have to grow and you cultivate, like a plant in the garden. You can have a beautiful forget-me-not in the garden, and cultivated, you really see it and you feel it. And in a meadow among weeds, you don't see it. So I knew that Adi was an optometrist. I didn't think much of it until midway through the shooting of The Act of Killing, when he'd spent years already watching all the footage of perpetrators that I had time to show him, and I learned that he was approaching the sort of older people in his door-to-door optometry work to ask them what they remembered of the killings. And then I started to realize, that must be powerful. So then I said, let's film that. And the film has The Look of Silence begins with a scene like that. And then I saw, this is powerful. She doesn't want to talk about something. She's part of a general blind desire not to look at something, and Adi's trying to help her see. And then I started to think, how can we film this where it really becomes a powerful metaphor? And I knew that this eye test would allow the perpetrators the time to fully confess to the worst details of what they've done, things they told me 7-8 years before. It would allow them to do that to Adi. That was very important, so that they don't feel trapped, that they're deciding to tell Adi everything. I knew the eye test would allow Adi to prolong that section of the confrontation for as long as possible, or as long as necessary, until everything had come out. And then I realized, wait a moment, the image of them boasting about these almost Dante-esque, kind of nightmarish things they've done to people with these scarlet red glasses, interrupted by Adi saying, now I'm changing the lens, do you see better or worse? Well, a little better. And then they move on and tell something else awful. I knew that would be a powerful metaphor. So instead of having you have two people talking, instead of having two complementary angles like this, I put one camera frontal on the man with the eye, getting the eye test, knowing that it would become a kind of surreal, dreamlike tableau. Yes, it's a metaphor for blindness and vision, but it's also something else. It's also kind of an image from hell. A man with these red glasses talking about the worst things we can imagine.